present with Mr. Chesnov and Mr. DeGuerin and his other counsel. All of our jurors have returned, and alternates. I'll let you know that Robin will be collecting that transcript from you that you used during that last videotape witness. She'll at the lunch hour. She'll pick that up from you. And the people are represented. People may call their next witness.
We'll call Janet Finke-Shaw, Your Honor.
Please come stand in the witness stand here. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly state that the testimony you're about to give and the cause now pending before this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Please be seated. Please speak directly into the mic. Please state and spell your first and last name.
Janet, Janet, Fink, Finke, Shaw, Shaw.
Thank you.
You may tip the mic. You could adjust the microphone, point it up a little bit so your mouth is closer. You may proceed, Mr.
Good
Lewis.
morning.
Good morning.
How do you feel about being here today?
Okay.
I'm going to ask you a number of questions. If there's something you don't understand, just let me know that you don't understand the question. Starting off, what state do you live in?
Connecticut.
And
Connecticut.
Pull the microphone closer to you and speak right into it. Don't be afraid.
Connecticut.
and can you tell me, what is your current occupation?
A residential builder.
You know what I think? I don't know if everyone can hear you in the back. You might need to even speak a little bit louder. Is the jury able to hear? They're nodding no, Your Honor.
All right. Perhaps someone can adjust the microphone for her so it's closer to her. You can slide it and talk right into it.
Okay.
And if you can you repeat the answer you just gave when I asked you what your occupation is?
A residential builder.
And as you stand here, you sit here, excuse me, do you recognize anybody in the courtroom today?
Bob Durst.
And is Mr. Durst seated in the wheelchair to my left?
Yes.
And can you tell me, how do you know Bob Durst?
I was friends with Bob and Kathy.
And I'm just guessing, can the jurors hear? Got negatives in the back, Your Honor. If you can, is there a way you can almost not yell, but really loud? When you're
Okay,
saying it?
I'm gonna try. Does this help?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, I was friends with Bob and Kathy.
And can you tell me, how did you meet Bob and Kathy?
I had a cleaning service, and I had a client that lived next door to them, and when they moved to South Salem, I was referred to them, and they hired me, and that's how we met.
And when you say that you were referred by clients, were those the mayors?
Yes,
And did they turn out to be Bob and Kathy Durst's next door neighbors?
yes.
And at the time that you first met Bob and Kathy Durst, approximately how old were you?
17.
So does that mean were you still going to school and also had this kind of part-time business?
Yes.
And if I were to ask you, were you closer to Bob or were you closer to Kathy?
If I had to pick, I would say probably closer to Kathy.
Would you also have called, so in other words, did you look at Bob Durst as your friend Kathy's husband, or did you actually look at Bob Durst as your friend Bob Durst?
My friend.
Can you tell me, what was Kathy Durst like?
Kind, thoughtful, intelligent, friendly.
And what was Bob Durst like at that time?
Nice.
Your Honor, I object to the characterization at that time. What was Bob Durst like?
Well, and I'm going to make it easy for you, Ms. Finke-Shaw, I'm going to be asking you questions about the individuals in this case, and I might ask you about how they were back at a certain time period, and then I might ask you how things were different later. So my first question was, and I'm asking you, what was Bob Durst like when you first met him?
Friendly and nice, professional.
I want to talk for a moment about your relationship with Kathy. Can you tell me, how close of a relationship was that?
I just had my service that I was taking care of their home, and they weren't around very much. So, it was a while before we became friendlier.
Over time, is it fair to say that your relationship with Kathy kind of went from you worked for her to actually being a personal friend?
Yes,
And did that also kind of coincide with you growing up and becoming an adult?
sure.
I want to ask you, during your conversations with Bob Durst back then, was he able to communicate and have conversations in social settings?
Yes,
And have you said in the past that Bob was charming and you were able to have pleasant conversations with him?
I had nice conversations.
I want you to describe, and I'm asking at the time you first met them, what did you observe with respect to Bob and Kathy and how they appeared to get along? What was their relationship like?
It seemed nice.
At any point in time, did you notice the relationship change?
After a period of time, yes.
And can you describe how it changed?
Maybe they, after a period of time began to not get along as well, and things were drifting apart.
And did you actually notice, could you tell in terms of the interaction that you would witness between them, could you tell as a kind of a bystander that the relationship seemed to be less close and more problematic?
I think it wasn't obvious early on that, it was a gradual thing.
And can you tell me, what did you notice? So if I were to tell you, how did the relationship change that you observed? What could you see?
I think I didn't see anything when it changed because I had moved to California, and I think it happened mostly at that time, once I had moved away from South Salem. So over the phone and conversations on how things were going.
So I'm going to get to that in a moment, but just so it's clear, when did you move from South Salem to California?
1979.
And when did you first meet Bob and Kathy, if you can remember the year?
1976.
So you knew them both about 3 years before you left.
Correct.
Were you aware, did you know Kathy Durst to ever use drugs?
Certainly not in the early days, and I wasn't there in California, so that's a no, and later, not myself.
And at some point, did you become aware that Kathy was using cocaine?
I think recreationally or occasionally later, toward the later days.
Would you ever characterize the Kathy Durst you knew as a cocaine addict?
Never.
And if I were to ask you on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being not at all and 100 being, an absolute addict, how would you characterize your observation and opinion of Kathy Durst with respect to cocaine?
1.
When I ask you, and I give the name Gilberta Najami, is that a person that you know?
I didn't know her very well.
But do you know who that is?
I knew of her from a few, times in the same room.
Did you ever met Gilberta?
Yes,
And is it fair to say she was a close friend of Kathy's?
yes.
And after Kathy disappeared, were you aware that Gilberta was heavily involved in investigating the case, for lack of a better term?
I was, not a lot of detail, but I was.
You indicated that you ended up moving to California in 1979. When you moved to California, did either Bob and Kathy individually or together, did they ever come to visit you?
Yes.
And Your Honor, can I just inquire, can the court ask the jury if they're able to hear me? I know the court has said before that sometimes my voice is not as, surprisingly, not as loud as I think it is. But can the court inquire if they're able to hear me okay?
Are jurors able to hear the prosecutor's question? Yes, they're nodding in the affirmative.
One person.
No, there was a negative there. All right, then, so a little louder, please.
All right, I'm going to turn it up. Can everybody hear now? Okay.
Yes, and you're welcome to use the lectern.
Make it easier on my ear.
The problem is with my computer, Your Honor, I
That's
need
fine.
it. I don't want it exposed. Okay. After you moved to California, did you continue to speak with Bob and Kathy by phone?
Yes.
And was that speaking with them together or was that separately?
It is separately.
And how often, let's take, who'd you speak to more?
Kathy,
And how often would you speak to Kathy?
often.
And when you say often, how often would that be?
Regularly.
Is that going to be?
Like in a week, we would always speak, in a month, we would speak probably 6 times or more.
And if I were to ask you, have you ever characterized your relationship with Kathy at this point as analogous to best friends?
Could you repeat that question, please?
Have you characterized your relationship with Kathy Durst at this point in time? Your relationship as best friends?
Your Honor, just for future reference,
What's your
how would
objection?
you, how would you characterize your relationship?
Overruled.
We were great friends.
And when you said that you would speak to her, this was always by phone?
Yes.
And was it during these phone calls, is that when you became aware that the relationship had changed for the worse?
Yes.
When you and Kathy would speak on the phone, were there conversations from Kathy regarding her unhappiness in her marriage?
Objection, hearsay, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Could you repeat that question, please?
During your conversations with Kathy, were there conversations on her end regarding her unhappiness in her marriage?
Yes.
When you would speak to Bob Durst, did he also echo that things were not as good in the marriage as they had been previously?
No.
I didn't hear your answer.
No. This is while I'm in California, because we didn't speak that often, and it was mostly,
How often would you speak to Bob Durst at this time?
not often. But if I, were to call and he were to pick up the phone,
If I were, not often, but
if I were to call Kathy and Bob were to answer, we would always have a nice introduction conversation before I talked to Kathy.
During this time, when you were in California, were there periods where Bob and Kathy were living together and periods where they were not living together?
Yes.
And is it at this time that Kathy discussed with you her intent to divorce Bob
Your
Durst?
Honor, I have to object again. Leading
Evidence code.
and hearsay, Your Honor.
Evidence Code Section 1250 and previously litigated, Your Honor.
Okay, overruled.
All right, I mean, I have a continuing objection then, Your Honor, so I don't have to interrupt.
Noted.
Thank you.
And we had a hearing, I've ruled on these issues.
I understand, but we're in trial now, and I want to make a record, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, can it be stipulated that counsel's objections pre-trial apply, that people will stipulate that counsel is objecting to everything that they objected to previously, so that...
Yes. It's a continuing objection is noted.
With that, Your Honor, then would that relieve counsel of the necessity, I
Yes.
believe, to object?
Yes, he doesn't want to have to object. That's
Thank
fine.
you.
Thank you both.
No problem. One moment, ma'am. Were there times during this period when the relationship between Bob and Kathy would get better and then get worse and get better again?
Were there times that would happen? Did
Yes.
you just ask me? Yes.
At some point in time, did you move back to New York?
I did.
And when was that?
Mid-1981.
And do you recall where you moved back to? Was that back to South Salem?
Right over the line in Connecticut.
And you know what, can you describe, South Salem is a town in Westchester County, New York, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Can you describe how big South Salem is?
Pretty small.
Small little town,
A
correct?
small town that borders Connecticut.
And how far away is South Salem from the Connecticut border?
Just, a mile.
And was it common for people to travel from South Salem to Connecticut and Connecticut to South Salem?
Yes, it was.
And where Bob and Kathy lived in South Salem, can you describe where that was?
On the lake.
And what lake
Very
was it?
country. Truesdale.
And when you said they lived on Lake Truesdale, did they actually live on the lake itself?
Yes, like lakefront.
And did they have, was it a large house or a small house?
It's a Darling Cottage.
It's kind of a little cottage on the lake, is that right?
Correct.
So you come back in the middle of 1981, and by this time, can you describe what Kathy was telling you the status of the marriage was?
I think things were pretty good at that time, at that moment.
Did things end up quickly changing?
I might not have been aware of it, but it seemed that it did, yes.
Now, I want to go back for a moment. I want to ask you, when I say the name Peter Schwartz, is that a name that you recognize?
Yes.
And were you present during an incident that happened in 1981 at the Durst apartment on East 86th Street in Manhattan?
Yes.
And at that time, were you visiting from California?
I was.
So this occurred before you moved back on a trip.
Exactly.
And can you tell me what happened during that night at that apartment?
I had come in to visit and I was going to stay over. I had just come in, so, just in from California. And everything was, it was great to see them. And Kathy had invited a few friends over. And anyway, everything seemed to be very nice. And then we went out. Bob and I went out. I'm not sure if other people were in a cab and also joined. I'm not sure.
Let me stop you. If you can you just try to speak up just a little bit louder? You indicated that you and Bob Durst left, and some other people might have been with you, left the residence. Where did you guys go?
We just went to a club called Xenon's. I had never been there.
And that was a club that was a popular club in Manhattan that was in a Durst associated building, is that correct?
I didn't know it at the time.
Did Kathy go with you to Xenon?
No, she stayed behind with a few people, and we were not gone for very long. Really quite quick, actually, and then we came back. And
Let me stop you. When you got back, can you describe what happened?
well, I wasn't in the room when anything happened. I was coming down the hall, probably took my shoes off, went to the restroom, I heard like, you know, a ruckus and, you know, you hear people, you know, kind of gasp a little, and I walked into the room
Heard
and
people gasp.
everyone was on their feet. Like,
Everyone was on their feet. Can you
Yeah.
tell me, when you walked out, what was the scene that you observed?
The gentleman you mentioned, Peter, had been kicked in the eye. I didn't see that happen, but I could see his eye was, you know, swollen and red and turning colors quickly.
And at that time, did people that were in the room who had seen it, did they blurt out to you what they had just seen?
Objection, Your Honor.
This has been litigated, Your Honor, evidence code
I don't
section.
go-
What's your objection?
Hearsay, multiple hearsay.
Okay, overruled, go ahead.
Did you remember my question?
Yes,
Oh, go ahead.
so, yes, you know, when something like that happens and then you're, you know, it's totally unexpected and, you know, so, you know, I said, what happened? And people told me, you know, that he was kicked in the eye.
Did the people say who had kicked him in the head?
Bob kicked him.
And was one of those people that was saying that Bob had just kicked the man in the head, was one of them Kathy Durst?
Yes.
And can you describe, what was her demeanor, her response at that time?
I think everyone, you know, it's an upsetting moment, so, you know, you're surprised and it's upsetting and you're thinking, oh my gosh, you know, what do you do now, right?
When you came home, to the best of your memory, was it just Kathy Durst and Peter Schwartz, or were there other people there as well?
I believe there were other people there as well.
And do you know, did Bob Durst voice to you, or did you hear him explain at any point that night why he had done that?
I don't.
Have you ever asked him about it since then?
That wasn't a conversation we had.
And had you ever seen Bob Durst act like that before?
No.
And when he acted like that, what was your response?
I was surprised, you know, hadn't expected anything like that.
And when you say that it's never been brought up, is that something that you have deliberately never asked him about?
Probably.
And can you indicate why?
I, you know, was it my business and I didn't want to get involved in afterward, you know, like that was my business.
Have you previously described Kathy's response as seeming, quote, shocked?
She was pretty shocked, yes.
During the time that you were in California, or any time after that, when you got back, did Kathy ever discuss with you any incidents of domestic violence that had taken place?
Can you repeat that question, please?
Either when you were in California or after you returned from California, did Kathy ever discuss with you any incidents of domestic violence that had taken place?
A situation when I was in California about being in her apartment on Riverside.
And did she talk to you about an incident where she had gone out on the terrace to the neighbors?
Yes.
And what did she tell you about that?
She had told me, it was in the morning,
Let me stop you. She told you in the morning, or she said the incident was in the morning?
no, I don't think the incident was in the morning. I think the incident was the night before I heard it.
Okay.
And she had told me that they had a fight and that she tried to escape through the window and he pulled her back in and it was horrifying and, you know, it sounded like one of the larger fights. To me, it was because I hadn't heard about fights like that, so I was very concerned.
And when she told you this, what was her demeanor as she was telling you the story?
She was crying, and she was sad, and she was worried.
Did she tell you during that discussion if she had sustained any injury when this happened?
I believe to my memory, that I thought she told me that her legs were scraped.
Did she indicate to you during that conversation if Bob Durst had a weapon?
That was the first time I heard that, yes.
What did she tell you?
She just said he had a gun.
And when she told you that he had a gun, was she telling you this as you were listening in what sounded like an informative statement, you know, Bob's got a gun, or was it a statement of Bob's got a gun and she was afraid?
She was afraid because of the whole situation combined, and that's what she said, he had a gun.
Did you ever ask Bob Durst about this incident?
No.
And again, if you know, can you tell me, this is not meant as criticism, I'm just asking, why didn't you ever ask Bob about it?
Again, I didn't.
When I say the name Prudence Farrow, can you tell me who that is?
I was told by Kathy that that was somebody who Bob knew.
And did Kathy complain to you that she suspected Bob had had an affair with Prudence Farrow?
She did.
And did Kathy comment to you about the effect that Bob's affairs had on her?
She did.
And did she indicate that that was a positive or a negative impact?
It was a negative.
Did she indicate to you that that was one of the reasons that she wanted a divorce?
I would say so.
Did you and Bob talk at any time prior to Kathy's disappearance about his situation with he and Kathy?
I think, yes. Just briefly about how he felt, about
And-
her wanting to get divorced.
And during that conversation, did he indicate to you that he did not know why Kathy wanted a divorce?
He said that, yes, he didn't know why she wanted a divorce.
And did you say anything in response to his comment?
I didn't.
When the two of you and Bob Durst were talking about Kathy wanting a divorce, did Bob communicate to you whether he wanted a divorce or whether he did not want a divorce?
I don't really recall exactly that conversation, but I felt that he didn't want a divorce.
And when you say you felt that, was that based on the conversation that you were having with him?
Yeah, just how I felt.
I want to go to January 31st, 1982. Is that a date that stands out in your mind?
Yes.
And why is that?
It was the evening that I was going to get together with them. They had come up to the country. We weren't able to get together, and that was that night.
And when you say they, is that Bob and Kathy Durst?
Both together, yes.
And when you say that night, did you later become aware that that's the night that Kathy disappeared?
Yes.
And can you tell me, what were your plans that night with the Dursts?
We had made tentative plans to have dinner.
And do you remember where you were supposed to have dinner?
We had made plans of where, maybe just even at home.
Do you remember anything about that night, as an example, the weather?
Yes.
And what do you remember?
I remember being in Westport, and, you watch the weather back east.
Let me just stop you for a second. When you say Westport,
Westport, Connecticut.
where is Westport, Connecticut in reference to South Salem?
That would have been at least a 40-minute drive.
So you were staying in Westport.
I was in Westport, and the weather looked like it was going to be bad weather. So, I'm thinking, driving. So I called to just, say how things, how's it going, and
Who did you call?
I called their house in South Salem.
And do you remember approximately when you called?
Probably midday, like 2:30.
And do you remember who you spoke to?
I talked to Bob.
And can you describe that conversation, please?
It was pleasant, and, I said, how's it going? The weather doesn't look good.
Did you guys discuss the plans for that night?
It was tentative, so we were just touching base at that point, and I was, thinking the weather was gonna be bad, and we'll see what happens with the weather.
Did Mr. Durst relate to you that Kathy was, where she was?
He said she went out.
And did he tell you where she was?
Yes.
Where did he say she was?
He said she had gone to Gilberta's.
And do you know where Gilberta lived in terms of not the address, but did she live in South Salem or Connecticut? Do
I
you know?
believe Connecticut.
And previously, have you referred to Gilberta at sometimes as Roberta?
Maybe.
And
Yes.
are you referring to the same person?
Yes.
So, Mr. Durst told you that Kathy had gone over to Gilberta's. Did he mention anything else about what the plans were, for instance, with he and Kathy for that evening?
No, I was going to follow up, watching the weather and call back in a little bit, see if she was back.
Did you end up calling back?
I did.
And approximately what time was that?
It's 4:30. It was going to be getting dark, and definitely the storm was coming in, so I was going to call and cancel.
And during that conversation, did you speak to Bob or did you speak to Kathy?
I spoke to Bob.
And during your conversation with Bob, did he tell you that he had actually spoken to Kathy at Gilberta's house?
I'm not sure.
Do you recall previously being questioned, and do you recall relating during your taped interview of
April 23rd, 2015.
Thank you. April 23rd, 2015, that Mr. Durst had told you that he had spoken to Kathy at Gilberta's that night.
I do.
And as you sit here, is that your best memory?
Yes.
Did Mr. Durst tell you during that conversation that you had with him when he said that he had spoken to Kathy, did he in any way relate to you what the conversation had been about?
That I guess she was going to be coming home, but my point in my conversation, my call was to make sure that we canceled, and that's what we did because of the weather.
And during the conversation, did Mr. Durst discuss anything about what was going on between he and Kathy?
No.
So it was pretty much you calling to make sure that he knew you were canceling, and him saying that he had been in contact with her at Gilberta's and she was coming home.
Yes.
Did you ever see Kathy after that night?
No.
How did you find out that she was missing?
I was at my brother's, and I received my brother answered the phone, and it was Bob, and that's how I found out.
And do you remember when that was in reference to January 31st?
4 or 5 days later, maybe. I don't know the date exactly.
And did you end up talking to Bob Durst that night?
I did.
And,
It was during the day.
oh, excuse me. And did Bob Durst end up telling you during that conversation that he had spoken to Kathy while she was at Gilberta's house?
I think, I don't really recall that coming into the conversation. I think he asked me if I had seen her.
And if you would have said on January 23rd, 2015, that Bob Durst had told you that he had spoken to Kathy while she was at Gilberta's, do you think that that would have been an accurate statement that you would have made?
I'm not 100% clear that at that time, at the conversation at my brother's house, that I recall it being a lengthy enough conversation to get into that much. I'm not 100%.
So let me ask you this, whether it was,
About Gilberta.
right, whether it was the conversation you had on January 31st or the conversation you had after Kathy disappeared, did Bob Durst tell you that he had spoken with Kathy while she was at Gilberta's?
Yes.
So your question is not whether the conversation took place, it's simply when it took place. Is that correct?
I don't know when it took place.
During this conversation that you had after Kathy disappeared, did Bob Durst tell you that he and Kathy had an argument before you took her to the train station?
Yes.
Do you recall specifically what he said about that?
He just asked if I had seen her, and I said no. And then I said, you know, why? And he said, because he hasn't seen her. And I said, what happened? And he said, you know, he put her on the train, and I asked if they had an argument, and he said yes.
Did you ask any more?
I didn't ask any more.
And was that intentional on your part that you didn't inquire?
I think, you know, again, you know, how I felt at the moment was, you know, I think my heart was in my throat, and my heart was pounding, and, you know, I didn't ask anymore.
Were you concerned at that point that Kathy might have met an unnatural?
Objection, Your Honor.
Grounds, Your Honor?
Calls for speculation on the part of the witness.
Mr. Lewin?
Your Honor, I'm not asking her to speculate, I'm asking her, was that her concern because it is relevant in terms of her response? It's not speculation, either she did or she didn't, it's relevant for the reasons indicated.
All right, overruled.
You're pretty shocked, and I was concerned, yes.
Did you ever confront, Bob Durst about Kathy's disappearance?
Confront, you have to be a little more,
Did you ever, at any point in time, ask Bob Durst, was he involved in Kathy's disappearance?
no.
And why did you not confront him in that way?
Again, I didn't have that opportunity to feel like I could say that.
Were you also concerned, in terms of your own personal fears, about bringing that issue up to him?
It's, you know, it's a difficult situation, so, you know, of course.
When is the last time that you spoke to Bob Durst?
In Connecticut with a phone call.
Did you end up meeting him about a month after Kathy's disappearance at the East Ridge Cafe in Ridgefield, Connecticut?
Yes,
And during that dinner, was it just the two of you alone?
yes.
And can you tell me, what did you and Mr. Durst talk about during that dinner?
We talked about how we were feeling as, you know, how are you in general. You know, first time I'd seen him since she was missing, so we just talked about, I said, how's things going? And then he had some questions for me, and we just chatted.
Did he ask you during that dinner to in any way assist with trying to help find Kathy, for instance, you know, searching for or organizing any kind of effort to find his missing wife?
We didn't get into details like that, but he asked me, you know, what I think might have happened and those type of questions. What do you
And-
think would have happened? What do you think happened?
Did you voice to Mr. Durst during that conversation any suspicion that you might have had about his involvement?
No.
And was that intentional?
You know, just not, you know, I wasn't gonna go there.
When I say the name Susan Berman, is that somebody that you know who that is?
I know of her.
And did you ever meet Susan Berman?
No.
Did you go to a book party for Susan Berman?
A book party?
Yes.
No.
Do you recall previously saying that you saw her at a book party, but you never had a conversation with her?
Not a boat party. I went to one time, when I went to Kathy's graduation to the nursing, and I thought that Kathy had said that she was there, but I can't be 100% sure on this, and he had said that that was one of Bob's friends.
And were you aware from Bob Durst that Susan Berman was a very close friend of his?
Yes, I was aware of that.
Were you also aware of that from Kathy Durst?
Yes.
And in terms of any contact that, as far as you know, you actually never had a conversation or actually met Susan Berman, is that correct?
Correct.
You are aware that in late 1999, you're aware now that there was a reinvestigation into Kathy's disappearance?
Yes.
And at that time, did you end up receiving, for the first time in a long while, a call from Bob Durst?
I'm not sure when I had that call, but I'm not sure the date of that.
Do you remember, was it you that reached out to Bob Durst, or was it Bob Durst that reached out to you?
He had called me.
And do you recall what the subject of that conversation you had with Bob was?
It was pretty general. It was nice. We had a nice conversation.
Did he mention to you that he was aware that the case had been reopened?
He didn't discuss that.
Did you ask him?
I didn't ask him.
And again, was that deliberate on your part?
Yes.
Did you receive after that other phone calls from Bob Durst that you did not pick up because you recognized the number that was calling?
I saw, because of caller ID, that he had called 2 times prior to me picking up. And those were the only 3 conversations, and we hadn't spoken after the time I did pick up, which was in the morning. I was home. So on the caller ID.
This is my last area. Would the Kathy Durst that you know, do you think that she would have just voluntarily disappeared?
No.
Would the Kathy Durst that you know, given your level of friendship, would she have taken off and just not have contacted you in all of these years if she were able?
No.
Was the Kathy Durst you knew, was she excited about becoming a doctor?
Very much so.
Would the Kathy Durst that you know have voluntarily abandoned her family, never to speak to them again?
No.
And if I were to ask you on a scale of 0 to 100, with 0 being, yeah, you know what, I could see Kathy just taking off, never calling anybody, and 100 being absolutely no chance that would ever happen, what would be your response?
Asked and answered, Your Honor.
Overruled.
Could you repeat that question, please?
So 0 meaning that you could see Kathy taking off, absolutely. 100 on the other side of the scale being there's no possible way that would ever happen. What would be your response?
100.
And as you sit here today, other than the issues involving what we're on trial for, is Bob Durst someone that you have any negative feelings towards?
Myself personally right now?
Yes.
No.
And have you previously said that you don't hate Bob Durst? He was someone you consider to be a friend.
I've said that.
Thank you. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Chesnov, you may cross-examine.
Thank you. Good morning, almost afternoon. My name is David Chesnov, and I'm one of Mr. Durst's attorneys.
Hi.
Welcome to California. In 2001, after Kathy's disappearance, how much time did the police spend with you as a former employee and a friend of Kathy's, talking about the similar things to the questions that Mr. Lewin may have asked you today?
This is in a, what setting was this?
2001. What police spoke to you, and please?
And you would like to know what, how long they spoke to me?
Yes.
45 minutes maybe?
So you're one of Kathy's friends, you were an employee, you knew Mr. Durst, and the amount of time that the police back contemporaneous with her disappearance spent with you was only 45 minutes, is that right?
It could have been longer, but
What?
I'm guessing 45 minutes,
Okay.
maybe an hour.
Did they see you more than one time.
Yes.
When was the second time?
Well, the first time was at my house when they showed up, and the other time was when I went to see them because that's what I was asked to do.
Right, and you went to see them because they had gotten some false information from a former in-law of yours about the circumstances of Ms. Durst's disappearance, correct?
Correct.
So people were lying about Bob back in 2001, correct?
That's going to call for a conclusion, Your Honor.
Okay.
It's also irrelevant in 352.
Oh, 352. Sustained.
The police called you to verify or corroborate some information they had gotten about Kathy's disappearance, correct?
Correct.
And it concerned Bob, correct?
It did.
And when you got there, you told them that what they were asking you about were lies, correct?
Yes, because it also involved something that they said I knew that was complete lie.
Right. People who were your in-laws had told the police facts that were supposed to have come from you as truthful, and you told the police it was an absolute lie, correct?
Correct.
So they were trying to say things about Bob that were lies back at that time, correct?
They were trying to tell me that I knew things that I absolutely didn't know myself. And
Thank you.
that was what it was.
So that second visit was not as long as the first visit, was it?
No, the first visit was just a visit to have me come visit them, which was the 45 minutes to an hour, could even have been longer, but I'm guessing that.
But in all this time, between that date and the time you met Mr. Lewin in 2015, no policeman ever talked to you again about Kathy's disappearance, did they?
Other than Mr. Lewin.
Correct. And so Mr. Lewin contacts you and you agree to a interview, correct?
Correct.
And Mr. Lewin recorded the interview, correct?
As I found out, yes.
Okay. Did you ever get an opportunity to review the interview that was done by Mr. Lewin and law enforcement back in 2015?
Yes.
When was that?
When I saw it, I'm not sure exactly when.
And they gave you a chance to correct anything that you might have said then that may have been transcribed incorrectly or you may have forgotten. Is that fair?
Probably.
Okay, and that interview took about 2.5 hours, if you recall. Is that right?
That's what it says.
Okay.
Probably
And-
seemed longer, Mr. Chesnov.
Sorry?
It probably seemed longer.
I know the feeling. Yesterday you had an opportunity to visit with Mr. Lewin to prepare for this. Is that correct?
It's correct.
Okay, and all these years, those are the events surrounding your information about the disappearance of Kathy, correct?
Correct.
You never met with the defense lawyers for Mr. Durst, did you? Or investigators?
I don't believe so.
Okay. Let's go back in time to the 70s, late 70s and the 80s. You're 17 years old, correct?
Yes.
And you're industrious, you start a business.
Yes.
And you're going to take care of the homes that, in large part, may be weekend homes for people who live in the city, correct?
Correct.
So it's a nice, beautiful spot on a lake. People live in the city during the week and work, and then on the weekends they come out, correct?
Correct.
And when you met Bob and Kathy to go to work for them, you liked them very much, didn't you?
I met Kathy first and then eventually Bob, and they were very nice.
And Bob was always nice to you, correct?
Yes.
Always acted like a gentleman,
Yes.
was polite,
Was polite.
never yelled at you as though you were just somebody working for him, treated you like an equal, didn't he?
Yes.
And you always got on real well with Bob, didn't you?
I got along fine with Bob always.
Bob would come out on the weekends when they were renovating the house, is that correct?
I don't recall that. I
You-
wouldn't have been there then.
Do you remember that Bob was there on the weekends?
Bob was there on the weekends.
Okay, and he would be enjoying his property as anybody who'd worked in the city during the week would, correct?
During those first years, while they were there on the weekends, I was not there with them every weekend, obviously. So I'm not quite sure what their weekends were about.
But I read your transcript of your interview, and you said that Bob was consistent. You never had a problem with him. He was even-tempered and always easy to get along with. Is that correct?
I found him easy, yes.
He also had what some would call a dry sense of humor, and you could actually be yourself with Bob, correct?
That's right.
He never treated you like you were an employee working for him. He treated you like a friend, correct?
Yes, I was quite young, and he was very nice.
And that's how he was with Kathy as well, in that time frame, correct?
Yes.
And he was obviously in love with Kathy, correct?
I don't know that answer, but I'm assuming,
Okay, well, you knew they were married, correct?
of course.
And you knew that you saw them be affectionate with each other on occasion, correct?
Correct.
And you have described their relationship as a good relationship, correct?
Early on, yes.
Okay. Now, when divorce discussions start among couples, things become strained, do they not?
Yes.
That's not unusual, right?
I don't think that's unusual.
Okay, so when Bob and Kathy starting having difficulties in their marriage, their conduct was not inconsistent with what happens with a lot of people when they're having trouble in their marriage, correct?
Probably, yes.
And just now on direct, Mr. Lewin asked you about what Bob wanted in terms of a divorce, and your testimony is Bob did not want a divorce, correct? That's what you told Mr. Lewin, right?
That's correct.
Okay, so that means Bob did not want Kathy to be gone from him in the marriage, correct?
I'm assuming. During maybe the earlier parts, yes. At the end, I'm not sure.
Okay, but when you were talking and answering Mr. Lewin's question, he was asking you at a point in time where the marriage was already strained, correct?
Yes.
And Bob was telling you, even though the marriage was strained, I want to keep my marriage intact, correct?
Yes, I think that was something I was told on the earlier side, yes.
Okay. Now, they lived well, did they not?
They had a nice life.
Right. They had plenty of money, correct?
I'm not aware of that.
Well, you knew that they had a second home, correct?
Sure.
And you knew that Kathy drove a Mercedes, correct?
They had a Volkswagen, too.
Okay, I'm not trying to argue with you.
It's the lunch hour. It's 12
Good time
o'clock.
for lunch, Your Honor.
I think it is a good time for lunch. Ladies and gentlemen, do not talk about the case or any of the people or any subject involved in it with anyone, including the other jurors. Do not make up your mind about the verdict or any issue until after you've discussed the case with the other jurors. During deliberations, we'll see you at 1:30 p.m. Record should reflect I admonished them out of the reporter's presence when we took our break. And you are to return at 1:30. Do not discuss your testimony with any other witness.